when you meet the families who have lost all these people. All of a sudden, all moral arguments stop about what kind of technology we're going to use to protect them, and you just completely go to this. I will use whatever I can to not put that person in harm's way. And so it's looking very much like robots are going to play a very large tactical role in the wars to come. And we're excited about that trend. I think it's going to mean a lot less death in this century than the last. And so I think there's something a bit snotty about a tech company coming in and going, well, we're going to put some restrictions around how you use what we do. We've really got to trust, our generals. I know a lot of generals in the U.S. military. They are great men and women, just flat out.
Today on Beyond Borders, we're doing something a little different with my guest, Mike LeBlanc. He hasn't crossed borders to find a new life in America, but he has crossed just about every other kind of border imaginable. He went from the streets of a Marine Corps base to the battlefields in the Middle East, from the military halls to Harvard Business School, and now from the startup world to the front lines of one of the most consequential and controversial technology races of our time. Mike LeBlanc is a 14-year-old Marine Corps veteran, a Harvard graduate, and the co-founder of Foundation, a San Francisco-based startup building what may be the world's first humanoid robot designed specifically for war. The robot, the Phantom MK1, is already being tested in Ukraine, and Mike has personally pitched the White House on arming it. He also has a book coming out on August 25th, What If Anger is the Answer, and a worldview that mixes in warrior, entrepreneur, and futurist. Beyond Borders has always been about people who are brave enough to leave behind what's familiar and build something new in unknown territory. Mike LeBlanc has done just that, and this is his story. Mike, thanks for joining me.
What a great intro. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So jumping right in, you've served 14 years and have done multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Most people who haven't served, such as myself, have no real idea or frame of reference for what that's like. Can you give us a bit of an idea of what it's like to be deployed into an active war zone?
It was really bizarre because to me, I didn't come from a military family. I'd never shot a gun before I joined the military, right? My first time was on the rifle range. So going to war was this huge question mark. You train, I trained for 2 years, 2 years and then pre-deployment. I mean, you've really got 3 years before you're going and doing this. But you still, when you're going there, you're like, what's this going to be like? And, it was very funny to me. You end up flying like commercial aircraft.
Right. Just with regular people.
Going like from California, we ended up somewhere in Germany, and then you start getting on a military plane. So the planes all start getting worse as you go to Afghanistan. And so you're like sitting coach, and you're like, oh, this is nice, And then you go to the next one, and you're like, okay, this is a military plane, but that's okay. Then you're like on there with some cargo. And then finally you're like on this small plane. You're like, are we going to get shot down? Like, why are we on this plane? Is this thing even fly? And you just kind of arrive, and all of a sudden it is desert just about everywhere, right? Except for the places that America had invested in some canals and things, so you have some green areas. But all of a sudden it's just desert. You're living with the Afghan National Army, and it's just a completely different world. It really is. It's a quick journey out there. It takes a couple days, but you are then in this totally different world, away from electricity, away from, anybody that knows computers, from people that speak the same language. And from there, I think everybody's experience becomes unique and then has a lot of the same patterns over them as well.
Wow. Yeah. Thanks for that little insight into what that's like, and the transition from, what we're used to here in the US to being in the middle of the desert with, a whole new world in a way. What did that kind of teach you about people? Yeah, I know you said you served with like the Afghan National Army. You obviously had enemy combatants and civilians. So in a new culture, a new world, what did that teach you interacting between different cultures and different people?
I think you really start to see just how much people are the same anywhere you go. People aren't great anywhere. Right.
That's a mix. Definitely.
It is always a mix. And I guess the ratio maybe changes depending on where you go. But yeah, it was always interesting to see that, I think a lot of things in human nature were more palpable in Afghanistan. You saw, it wasn't the case where these people were protecting their homeland. In Ukraine, I've just been going to Ukraine recently. You talk to people about, oh, when did you join the military? And they're like, well, if I don't, my family will die behind me. And you're like, oh, that's a good reason. That makes sense. But
Hmm.
in America, a lot of us had joined kind of with this idea of what it meant to be a soldier or warrior. And Afghanistan, so many were there for the money, and they really didn't think of themselves as Afghans. We called them the Afghan National Army, but they thought so much more of themselves in provinces. Many of the soldiers that we talked to, or the civilians that we would talk to, had never heard of Afghanistan. They didn't know that they were in Afghanistan. They were like, I don't know where that is. And and so you really start seeing these people that are many of the soldiers are there for money, and there's a lot of corruption that goes through there. So a lot of stealing the money. As we drive through, we had a little spot that we would call Disneyland, where the kids would jump all over our convoys and take off all of our supplies off the sides of our trucks. You were really put into a Hobbesian reality where everyone was looking out for themselves. With some exceptions to that, but
Right.
it really puts you in a natural state that I think when you come back, you go, oh, that's what everybody does. We just do it more politely.
Okay. Yeah. So it's kind of coming back to your base nature, and maybe here there's layers on top of it, but it's always there.
It's so interesting to see because you know for them you would think, okay, they're going out and looking for Taliban, for example, and that's what you think before you get out there. You go, that's what we're going to be putting a stop to. But really, people are trying to dodge the patrols. They don't want to go out. They're trying to find excuses out of them. They're trying to funnel money. They all have little schemes
Mm.
for the Americans and for their own money, for their own budgets. And I think that the danger is for anybody. As you go through time and start to recognize these patterns, you get more cynical. And so the push on yourself is really to be able to pull yourself back and say, even though that's all going on, how do I operate within that, and what can we build despite that?
Wow. Yeah. And you mentioned it briefly, but then I mean, it must be quite a shock coming back home and re-entering civilian life. What was that transition like? And did you kind of feel like a stranger back in your own country?
Very much so. Yeah, I think it's especially interesting because we used to go to war, and the Odyssey is all about the years that it takes Odysseus to get back to Ithaca, right?
Right.
Like that there was a journey there. And now, we don't even have to take a ship back. You just, on one day you are patrolling in Afghanistan, and maybe 2 days from then you're at Applebee's with your family. And
Ah,
it's a very stark change. It's like changing the channel from a horror movie to a kids show. It's just very very stark. And I think that's a main reason that a lot of veterans come back and have this extra edge or aggression, or I definitely don't think about it as PTSD. There's something that you learn over there, and to come back so fast, it's almost like being teleported to fly back that soon from a different culture.
I can only imagine, yeah, the contrast and the speed of it. And the adaptation period takes you much longer than the 2 days to come back, of course.
Yes.
So after you came back, you went to school and you went to co-found a robot security startup, which is actually how we met, Cobalt. I think you said you had a third of the jobs went to veterans and was a dedicated effort to do that. You then sold it with your co-founders, and you swore you never do hard tech again. Yeah, here we are. So what made you break that promise?
It was really interesting. I had talked to one of our board members, was Alfred Lynn from Sequoia, and I went to him with my big lesson from Cobalt, and I said, I'm never going to do hard tech again. We had robots, out in 9 different countries on 4 continents.
Hmm.
We were all different time zones. You're traveling constantly, and you're up in the middle of the night. And I was saying to him, it's way easier to sell software and enterprise software. We had big customer names. I was like, I can sell
Mhm.
big software and deploy it. And he said to me, well, Apple and SpaceX and Tesla, those are all hard tech companies. He was like, it's not really about hard tech or software. It's what your specific skills go to and how you build it. And that was when I gave that a lot of thought when he said it, and I started going back to other founders. Right. I think a lot of you jump in and you kind of look at whatever founders are around your time. So Jeff Bezos. I was always following everything Jeff Bezos did.
Mhm.
But after selling Cobalt, I had this thought of who are the best founders ever. And I was looking back at things like sewer systems. Sewer systems are great, great technology, but you don't really have one person that spearheaded that, right? It's those end up being government projects. And the best that I could find was Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison is, around the time of Teddy Roosevelt, and Teddy Roosevelt kind of laid out the path for a modern president. Thomas Edison laid out the path for modern founders of what that looks like to be a tech founder. And I started realizing he did not shy away from hardware at all, right? And even went toward building infrastructure like power plants and things, and started realizing if you really want to have big effects on the way that people live and on what human life looks like, hard tech is maybe your best bet. There aren't that many softwares that have really changed life. GPS would be one, but there aren't many. Whereas hardware, it's pretty easy to name, the car, the airplane, lights. There's a lot of hardware that changes our life very significantly, and so that got me very excited about the project again.
Great. Yeah. To be fair, I think Thomas Edison didn't have a lot of software to work with at his time.
Well, services, he would have had services, and
Absolutely.
services are always easier too. But that was where you look at life from I'm 40, right? So from the time I was born in 1986 to now, not that much has changed about the basic of what it looks like to wake up in the morning, get ready, and when you watch a movie from the 80s, it looks about like what it does today. We have our stuff's a little cooler, it's a little faster, but if you went from 1900 to 1940, you would have, in 1900, you would have had a horse, you would have
Mm.
had candles lit all over the place. You would not believe that heavier than air flight was possible. And so, if you wanted to go to Europe, it would be a once in a lifetime trip that you would take a ship for weeks to go to. I mean, and by the time you were 40 years old, all of that had changed. You could now
Mhm.
take a flight right over to from New York to France, be there in a couple hours. Everybody had TV. Almost every home had electricity. So it's a very very stark change in those times, and I think that comes from a lot of hard tech that really makes life feel different.
Interesting. I'm about the same age, a bit younger than you, but I think we've seen a lot of change as well. All right, like telephones, like smartphones, mobile phone. I remember having all the phones in the home as a landline, right? Or the ADSL and the internet and like Wi-Fi kind of coming and computers. So there has been a lot of change. Maybe it's not as drastic as like flying and having electricity.
Think about the difference between a horse to a car
Right. Yeah.
and a landline to a cell phone. there
Yeah.
there's a much smaller gap there, and so we've seen much more incremental change, I think,
Hmm.
during our lifetime.
Right.
And that's where really, I mean, I think that AI is now, it's a mix of AI and new American ambition,
Mm.
but they're finally coming together to maybe make some significant changes about what life looks like.
Well, let's talk about what you're building with AI and hardware and the combination of the two. So you're building a robot that's built for war, right? So it has an AI layer, that's its brain, and it has a metal body, the robot itself, that kind of work together. It's a bit of a terrifying thought, if I'm honest, for me. But I could see that it could be also very, it could be a positive in some ways. In your article in the Times, you describe it as a moral imperative to put robots into war instead of soldiers. Can you tell me a bit about what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think that 90% of veterans would agree with that statement.
Fair
What
enough.
we're,
Hmm.
I mean, I feel always the same about, about meat, for example. It seems like anybody that goes to a meat plant and actually watches how we slaughter animals, there's a good portion of those people that stop eating meat, right?
Yeah.
And the rest of us kind of know that that's going on, but we haven't seen it, we haven't made it personal, and so we keep enjoying our hamburgers. And I think that war is very much the same way. So for those people that have gone to it and that have seen, you know, somebody's 19-year-old son walking in a patrol and stepping on an IED, right? And there goes their life just like that. When you meet the families who have lost all these people, all of a sudden all moral arguments stop about what kind of technology we're going to use to protect them, and you just completely go to this. I will use whatever I can to not put that person in harm's way. And so, it's looking very much like robots are going to play a very large tactical role in the wars to come. And we're excited about that trend. I think it's going to mean a lot less death in this century than the last.
Interesting. Isn't there the risk of it being a more asymmetric warfare that would cause a lot more death on one side and maybe a lot less on the other? If
It
one
could
has
be.
robots and the other does not, or different levels of robots.
It's interesting. In if you look in the 20th century of where death came from, times of peace were much worse than times of war. Even though we had really a lot of deaths racking up through World War II, through Vietnam. You saw just a lot of lives going out. But in what we would call peacetime, mostly you would see governments killing their own people. And sometimes this would be a mix through some form of slavery or very low wages and hard work.
Mm.
Sometimes it was just mass killings. But when you compare that, what goes on in the peace to the wars, it doesn't really compare. Peace is no picnic. And and I think that in those situations, if you look back at the countries that were there aren't going to be a lot that have top end militaries. They're
Right.
doing that with AK-47s. They're just a lot of bullets going around, a lot of bullets and fire and knives and things. When you really look at the world wars and what it looks like for near peers to go into combat, that's when you start seeing these major weapons come into play. And I think we've already kind of opened Pandora's box, because nuclear weapons are already around, right? So we've already taken the most destruction that we can see, and everything else that we do with a weapon is layering in some spectrum of that conflict. And that's everything from punching somebody in the face, to tasering somebody, to shooting them with a beanbag, to letting loose a bunch of humanoids, to whatever. They're going to go up in this spectrum. And I think that as we add nuance and ability through those weapons, you can actually stop being so brutal, because the end of war is not to kill a lot of people. The end of war is to reach your political will, whatever it is that you want to get done by, and through causing suffering. But suffering doesn't need to be through death of humans. It can be in destruction of assets. It can be in just breaking the enemy's will. So no, I think humanoids will be an incredible part of that new system.
You touched on a lot of very interesting points there, and I want to like kind of rebound on a few. Definitely the analogy to like nuclear weapons, I think is very interesting. But first, when you're talking about this weapon or a robot as a weapon, it can be something very positive in the right hands, potentially, but it could be devastating in the wrong hands. And I think of like a repressive regime, and we can think of many without naming any. If they start having robots and using it against their own people, that would cause another level of death that we maybe haven't seen before, right? They're not going to nuke their own people, but they would shoot their own people. And why not do it if they have robots? Just have the robots shoot the people. And then how could you ever stand up to that?
In those situations, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a minority that's really able to fight back against a genocide, right? The reason is that it's a genocide is one side is just so much stronger. So you already see huge asymmetry in the deaths on both those sides. It's not like one is, taking 40% casualties and the other 90. It's usually about, 99% and 1%. That's
Right.
usually
Yeah.
the ratio that you're seeing.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, I really think as we unlock new tools, guns are already there, right? Machine guns have already been invented, bombs of all sorts, drones, right? We and in drones we already see robots, right, taking this all on. So in many ways, this is just a ground force that complements what we've already seen going on in drone warfare.
Well, yeah, and speaking of, I think that's something you've tested out on the Ukrainian battlegrounds, a bit of your robot. Obviously, that's kind of the new frontier in terms of war technology and drone technology is being tested out there. So you have sent, I think, a couple of robots to test them out. Can you tell us a bit about what happened? What did you learn? And what surprised you about having the robots actually deployed?
You know, so yeah, going back and forth from Ukraine, it's been really interesting. Just this year, I did my first trip in February out to Ukraine, but you really start to recognize that these are robot centered battles. So most of the battles that are going on are drones versus drones, or drones versus automatic weapons, something like that. And it's very interesting to think of that because we think, yeah, okay, they're both flying up there, and that's a separate thing. Those would normally be lives that were going out. People would have to go do that. People would have to push forward. They would get shot at. They would shoot back. That's the normal run of things. But what I saw when I went there was a full robot war where you're watching drones. You go for reconnaissance. They're also armed, uh, and you're also seeing ground vehicles. So like little automatic ATVs with no person in them, and maybe like a 50 caliber machine gun, some kind of heavy machine gun on top of them. And those were doing coordinated attacks. You could go and sit with these guys who were actually directing all of these. Right, they weren't far from the front lines, but they're not on the front lines, and sitting on computers and driving these, looking through their cameras, deciding what to do. So it was really incredible. What we went over there thinking, what will the humanoids do? And the main, our main kind of thesis was supply reruns. So they're in kind of stronghold positions. They still have to leave their stronghold position to go get new supplies and to bring them back. And so we thought that would be a good use case for the robot. What we ended up finding was really they all of the strong positions are built to deny anything that's not a human shape, because soldiers have to come in and out of them, but they're doing things to block wheeled vehicles. They're doing things to cover themselves and conceal from drones. So you end up with this kind of human shaped hole in anybody's defense that ends up being kind of like in Star Wars and the Death Star. That's the vulnerability, the trash chute, is this humans have to go in and out. And so the human shape was a lot more interesting to the Ukrainian military than we had thought. And they started turning us on to all kinds of new use cases that we were looking at. But primarily now we're discussing arming these robots and what that would look like to be able to send them in for an attack.
On one side, that sounds maybe great because you may be saving human lives. On the other side, I have been to Ukraine as well, and one of the nights we got like they were bombing us, right? Like in
Yep.
Kiev, and they were bombing Kiev, and they were bombing. I think a drone hit apartment building, so they don't have any qualms of hitting civilian targets. And for me, maybe that's a fear that like this would exacerbate that. If you can send a robot and just mow down tons of civilians, they're just defenseless, right? If it's robot against robot, that's one thing. But if it's one robot against a city, I don't know. Like how do you mitigate that or how do you stop that?
Well, I think that's where you've really got to look at. War's terrible. There's almost a don't hate the player, hate the game aspect to it, right? War is a very horrible thing. And so what tools we use to get to our ends, the faster that you can do that while causing the least suffering, that's the goal. Is to really be able to figure things out through diplomacy, and violence ends up being an arm of that. But I think that's where, when I was joining the Marines, I was reading all these articles about Afghanistan. I was learning about the war and thinking, this has got to be the stupidest war we've ever waged. It's a terrible, terrible war that makes no sense, has no end in sight. Just didn't agree with any part of it, and I almost didn't join the Marines because of that. I wrote a letter to a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters, who was writing a lot of op-eds at the time about how bad the war was. And why I was so interested to talk to him was he was a soldier, in uniform, who was writing against the war constantly about how bad the war was, how stupid its aims were, how it was never going to end. And I got in contact with him on the phone, and he told me, he said, who you vote for, that's who's going to determine where your nation is going to fight. They're going to just determine when and how they fight. So you've got to be very careful about who you put in charge. But once that person is in, you don't want them going to battle with, a limp sword. He was like, as a soldier, you're part of the integrity of the sword, you're the strength of the sword. Give them the strongest sword that you can, and then, like as a voter, as somebody who writes op-eds, as anything, that's where you really try to speak out and guide them in America. But that's been my thought on robots in war too. Is we want to give the tool. How we use the tool, I think, is up for great debate and should be a continued debate about how we're actually employing these, right, and who we're putting in charge of them.
Just to rebound, so you were kind of opposed to the war, and you still signed up. Like, what made your decision? How do you kind of, I don't know, like not have cognitive dissonance in that
Yeah,
context?
well, that was where that's what really did it for me, was that conversation with Ralph Peters, where I started realizing I do want to be part of, the strong American military. I want to help strengthen the American military, even if, in that particular case. I mean, I thought, it was funny back then when I joined. Iraq was known as the bad war, and Afghanistan was the good war, and they were both very silly wars, and we just never should have gone into either of them. But I did look at that and I thought, well, that's a voter issue, and I can certainly push for that on, as a voter and as somebody that talks to other people and might influence a few other voters. But at the end of the day, I don't want America to be weak. We want to be resolved in whatever the decision is that we make.
I understand that. So I have a thought around like how, as a human and as someone who's a military personnel, it's your kind of legal duty to disobey any illegal orders, right? As a machine and an AI robot, I guess that could be coded in to some degree, or it could be changed. How do you control, what it does or doesn't do, and who controls it? Who allows it to, what's the boundary where it can go to?
Yeah, so the U.S. military would control all of the U.S. military's robots, right? That's just kind of central to how drones have developed. I was part of a team in Bahrain. I think that we were one of 7 different approval layers that it would have to go through before we did a strike on anything. You had to go through all the intelligence, all the reports, and say, are we sure that it's no civilian casualties? Have we watched a pattern of life study for 3 days of people walking in and out? I mean, really high standards. I think that the military will continue those with whatever AI tools they have. The military is going to be in charge. The military does not like giving up their control there. But really, this debate comes down very similarly to, Waymo and autonomous vehicles versus human drivers, because you really are talking about, in the case of drivers, a bunch of 16 18-year-olds that are causing a lot of accidents.
Yeah.
In the case of the military, you're looking at 18 to 20-year-olds that are causing a lot of those accidents. It will be much tighter, but I think that we have a human aversion to any robot that's making one of those mistakes.
I mean, yeah, I agree. Although I disagree with the premise of the autonomous driving and the autonomous weapons being on the same footing. One is like the whole goal is to save lives. The other one is to end them. So I think they're a bit in opposition.
Oh, well, no, I wouldn't think like that.
Okay.
No, the thought is very much to save lives, right, and to end wars. You know,
But by taking lives, the way to get there is to be a weapon. Like a Waymo should not be a weapon ever. Like, it should
that's true.
never like kill anyone, right?
Yeah,
But these robots will kill people no matter what, even if it's the goal of safety. Yeah.
if you compared deaths again in the 20th century of humans that killed other humans to car accidents, you'll have a lot more of humans that killed other humans. So that is if you were just looking at this from a complete managerial standpoint, that would be the place to affect that you want to get the deaths down. If you could get a meaningful percentage of those deaths down, that's going to save a lot more lives, and a lot more innocent lives is also an important thing to add. But that's where I think where wars are going when it is just two villages going at each other with machetes and fire. There is a lot of death. There are a lot of civilian casualties. There's just complete destruction and terror. As we get more targeted with these weapons, you do see the big actors acting much differently. So even Russia in Ukraine, it's it does have qualms about how it's attacking civilians. It's not just openly attacking civilians. It does it by accident, or we could talk about what the reasons are. But if Russia wanted to just kill civilians, it could just wipe out all of Kyiv, very quickly. The trouble that they're having is that they're telling Ukraine, you have misguided leaders. You're actually part of Russia. We want to bring you back, right? And so that's why they can't quite attack over there. But what you saw while I was there were a lot of bombings. It was bombings of energy facilities, right? And so they're going
They
after
also
infrastructure.
bomb the center of cities, though, which have no infrastructure that they could. It's obviously civilian aimed, right? If you're
Yes,
aiming at the
but
center of a
very
city.
it's a lot different than an enemy that just wants to wipe them out, right? Russia has
I
had
understand that, but they also do want to inflict terror and will take civilian lives. I don't think they have a lot of qualms around it because they've been bombing cities for 4 years, not just energy infrastructure. But
yeah.
I think I'm not getting in the mind of the Russians and what they're doing here.
Wouldn't it be great though? Wouldn't it be great if what a war did look like was targeting data centers and energy infrastructure
Of
and
course.
not seeing
Yeah.
a lot of, if you're shooting the railroad and not the train, we've done something right. Even though it still looks very ugly, it still looks very destructive. It's actually huge progress.
I totally agree. Yeah, of course. If we can avoid most of the human cost of battles and just be on strategic targets, that makes a lot more sense. I want to shift a little bit to a recent debate that's been kind of happening with the government and Anthropic and OpenAI, which I'm sure you're very aware of, where there was a disagreement with Anthropic at first that they wanted to not have the government in their clause to work with them that had two clauses I think they had issue with, which was mass surveillance and autonomous killing weapons or autonomous killing machines. And Anthropic, which is pretty safety focused, told them they didn't want to do it if those clauses were in. OpenAI jumped in and said, "There's no problem, we'll do that." So how do you feel about that controversy? How do you feel about automated killing machines if that's the path we're going down? What does that mean?
Yeah, I very much think the military needs to be making the decisions about what weapons look like and what weapons do. And that's gone very well for us in the past. That's gone very poorly for us in the past. That is always that's just one of those eternal things that you don't know how the military is going to use the tools that you give them. And I think that's why, especially in a democracy, we need to be very dedicated to keeping people in check of how they're using these tools, and you keep them in check through votes, right? Get the right people in there that don't want to fight these wars, that don't want to cause unnecessary suffering, that don't want to put unnecessary lives at risk. Those are the really important places to act. But once you give those tools to the military, that's who we trust with this. That's who we trust to keep us safe. And just as we don't know if they're going to use a rifle to kill a civilian or to kill a threat to the United States, we've got to trust them with that. And so I think there's something a bit snotty about a tech company coming in and going, well, we're going to put some restrictions around how you use what we do. We've really got to trust, our generals. I know a lot of generals in the U.S. military. They are great men and women, just flat out. They really are. They have a high degree of integrity, of accountability. Uh, and we could have disagreements about all kinds of things. I would have disagreements across all kinds of things with them, but they're professionals who have done this for decades. So I don't propose. I got out as a major. I don't propose to tell them how to fight, how to use their weapons. I want to make them the strongest tool that I can offer them.
I wouldn't. What would I tell them as a person who's a civilian either? Like I don't know anything about their job, and it's about voting. I think you said it right. It's about what we decide to have as policy, as people enforcing it. Um, but it depends on what it's applied for, right? So I think you recently pitched the White House as well for potential border patrol applications. So I think that may be somewhere where people have a lot less trust than
Yeah.
maybe the military institutions with ICE and Border Patrol. And if they start getting robots, what does that mean for just everyday Americans, for people here who may be here legally but look a certain way, or maybe here illegally but don't want to be taken, down by a robot? How do you think about that if it's deployed on U.S. territory, for example?
Yeah, I think elections have consequences. And I mean that's what we're really seeing. As the government is much louder about what it's doing these days. I don't know that it's a lot different in many aspects that we see. Right, ICE is certainly an example of something different that we've seen. Right, of going after that. But it's a political response from both sides of wanting to get stronger on border security from having it lapsed for too long. And I think when we have kind of a sleeping government that is not doing much of enacting our laws, uh, this is where the pendulum swings back. And so this is always the problem, is that the pendulum doesn't stop in the middle, right? And so you see these kinds of extremes. But again, that's where I go. You really have to be, as a voter, in a disagree and commit mode. You can't be, yes, I'm staying with it. I'm an American citizen, but I'm going to try to thwart you from the inside. Right? It's got to be, that's where you've got to think, who are the leaders going to be? How can you put political pressure? That's how our system works. And so in any of these, it's almost akin, to not sell to someone like DHS would be akin to an employee that doesn't like that you're serving a certain customer, so they make sure to serve them a bad product. It's, quit the company. If it's that big of a deal, quit the company, but never thwart it from the inside. You don't want to sabotage your own team.
Fair enough. Although it's a little harder to quit a country than a company, maybe for a lot of people.
Well, hard, but there are certain things that the country could do that I think would make just about everybody leave, right? Depending on just how bad it gets. But I also think that is where I'll be an American my entire life, right? And it's always going to be where, who can we get back in power, no matter who's in power that I don't like, or what an administration looks like.
Right.
It's very much, well, what can I do to help get the next administration and put the right pressures in place, because they're going to respond to votes.
Yeah, of course. Well, I don't want to get too political. I want to focus still on what you're working on and what's the kind of future of war, really. And in that context, I am sure Russia and China are developing some things that are very similar to what you're building. And there's kind of a war, a race of weapons and the next technologies for war. How do you see that? It's kind of terrifying, when you hear, oh, China and Russia are developing robots for war as well. That's pretty scary. What do
Yeah.
you think of that, and how does that kind of balance between U.S., Russia, China, other powers?
Well, I think if you sit and think about the weapons that are out already, they're pretty scary.
Yeah.
It's not hard to get scared of things that are used in war, and when you see, I mean, our enemy always looked like a, sort of scarf over their face, so it's not even looking human, with some kind of machine gun on top of a Ford Ranger. When you picture what that's actually like to drive up to you,
Yeah.
it's a terrifying thing. You don't feel that much better thinking, well, that person could die, or could be stopped. A robot could be stopped too. Um, and so I definitely agree with you. It's scary. The thought though of kind of large robot battles, of different form factors of robots, either in the sky or on the ground or in the sea, all fighting each other. Uh, that to me is really, again, it'll be a scary thing to think if any of them break through, what would happen. But compared to humans fighting humans, it's a huge upgrade for everyone. So I think it's kind of a dream to think that we would have robot on robot forces, that we have drones and counter drones, that we have humanoids on humanoids.
But you don't see it as being robot on humans.
It
It would
certainly
just be equal footing. Yeah.
it certainly could be, and probably will be. The thing is, as you get stronger weapons like that, though, people tend to lay down their weapons a lot more often, right? And so it's also, I think that there's a large myth that people believe that high technology is going to beat low technology in a war, and historically there's just no basis to thinking that. That's not how wars have been won. It's been, an important factor, but not the decisive factor in most wars that we've fought. And so again, this is another tool in the toolbox,
Right.
for people to use, but it's not going to mean that you win every one that you go into against a country that doesn't have humanoids. It doesn't mean that you're going to lose anyone against a country that has humanoids when you don't.
Sure. Yeah. It makes me think of Vietnam, right? Like the
Yes.
asymmetry between the technology and war and forces was so big, and yet no one could win there because France went and U.S. went, and no one could beat them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we see that in large scale wars. We see that in small conflicts. It's an interesting thing because you would think that if you have the most technology, you're going to win. But, bringing a knife to a gunfight historically has not been the worst tactic.
Yeah. So you know talking about deterrence a bit, you had mentioned this briefly before as maybe a parallel to nuclear weapons. We haven't really seen nuclear weapons being that huge of a deterrent. Like there's still a lot of wars. There's new wars right now, kind of all over the world. So it has not been that much of a deterrent. I mean, Ukraine would probably beg to differ since they gave up their nukes and kind of did not get the counterpart of that agreement upheld. And if they had nukes, maybe Russia would never have attacked them. So there is a part of deterrence, but not entirely. How do you see robots kind of playing in that equation?
Yeah, well, that's where I think, the largest weapons sometimes have a smaller hand than the smaller weapons, right? So like machine guns had a huge effect on war, and which side had machine guns, even though it wouldn't cause two nations not to go to war, because one would be looking at the other and say they have a lot of machine guns. It had a very large effect in the actual battles and in breaking the political will. Because what happens when you have an open war and lots of battles is ultimately leaders at each side that are thinking, yes, we're going to keep fighting these battles, and how many did we win, how many did we lose? And it's almost like being a coach of an NFL franchise, right? When you've just got too many losses in a row, you're looking and going, wait, my job is on the hook here, right? At what time do we call it? And that's unfortunately, I mean, that's how wars end, is by somebody just going, we can't go on. So I think it's through the tactical battles that you'll see that will broken. So there's full on deterrent of, we just don't want to mess with them, which is a great thing if you can get it. I don't know how often a weapon has caused that one way or the other, but in breaking someone's will, weapons have played a large role, and the employment of weapons, of course, played a major role.
So it's hard to imagine where we're going in a world that's going to be fought and run by robots, I guess, but we'll still be part of it in some way. I kind of want to shift gears as we're reaching maybe the end, and a little bit more on a personal note. You've crossed a lot of borders. You've been in a lot of different contexts in the military, in a war, and as a civilian, now as a founder. How do you kind of reinvent yourself? How do you kind of keep changing and adapting to these new environments, contexts? Do you have any advice for the rest of us that may be not as good as you, as just jumping from one to the next?
I think that curiosity as a driver is much stronger than just about anything else that you can come up with. If it's greed and you want a lot of money, it's hard, and it shifts. If it's just ruthless ambition to just be something, that's better than greed, but it's still limited. When you really have curiosity to get into new things, I think it's the whole world is open to you. And we had, in the military, they used to have a thing where they'd say, get smart on this, right? You got to brief about Korea tomorrow. Get smart on Korea, and it was a really funny, it's very military kind of flat-footed way to go about it. But you had to give a brief the next day on something you knew nothing about. And you have to sit and think, well, what are the questions that I'm going to be asked by a commander? And you learn those very quickly. And, I mentioned the canals in Afghanistan. I loved learning. I had no idea before I went to Afghanistan that it was a project called Little America, where we actually put in all of the canals into southern Helmand, with the idea that if they had water, they could have plants, they could have agriculture, and it would actually cause more peace over there. It was such an interesting thing to start learning about and to see how it had played out. And so I think when you have curiosity as your driver, you can be looking at wars, you can be looking at robots, you can be looking at really anything, and very quickly guide yourself to the most important things, because the most interesting things are usually the most important.
Yeah. And I'm sure ambition, maybe a little piece of greed, and a lot of hard work also goes into all of that.
That-
What do you think about economic development and kind of general prosperity as the best hedge against war, terrorism, and you were talking about building the canals in Afghanistan and hoping that giving them access to food and these things would help kind of mitigate conflict. How do you think about that versus having to wage wars and sending weapons?
Yeah, I'd have to think more about it. It's interesting. I mean, in Marja, it certainly did not work. That was a very failed experiment of what they had tried to do. I think that a good way to avoid smaller conflicts, like we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, uh, is to give people something to lose. So I think economic development is a great way to give people something to lose. Whereas when they don't have that, recruiting for the Taliban is pretty easy.
Yeah. Yeah, if you have nothing to lose, what's the alternative? To might as well fight.
Overall, we've also seen, we've seen a great rise in China economically, throughout our lifetimes, and that has turned into a much larger threat. And so, yeah, I'd have to give more thought to what I actually think economic development is. But my instinct is that there's a sweet spot.
Not too much, not too little.
Not too much, not too little is usually a
Yeah.
good a good way to go.
So you also have a book that's coming out August 25th. I want to talk a bit about that. It's called "What If Anger Is the Answer?" Pretty provocative title, especially from someone developing killing machines. Could you tell us a little bit more about the book and what's the answer? You know?
Well, after this conversation, yeah, I definitely sound like a crazy person with my killer robots and my what if anger is the answer. The thought behind the book is is really, if you don't have moments of acute anger, you have chronic resentment. That's kind of the core thesis of the book, and I think that the Marine Corps does a great job at helping people bring out a controlled aggression, so that you can bring it in places that actually move things and move things productively. And so the book, I wrote the book over a number of years, largely as I transitioned back from war into American civilian life, of just seeing how much there was in corporations of people that weren't speaking their minds, employees that were, quiet quitting, that were resentful toward management, uh, that had really they'd found no way to speak their mind, and so instead they would swallow that all up and kind of live and play a role that they didn't want. And so what I do in the book is really take out what I think the Marine Corps teaches about that, what I think the ancient Greeks taught about that, to really understand how can you actually use anger to build things and form organizations, rather than kind of just wallowing uh, and having tantrums, about things.
So is that a culture you instill in your companies to be angry?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I think it's certainly what begins as an anger, because there's a right time to be angry in
Mm.
business. There was a great, in I think it was like 2013, Howard Stern had a leaked video of him talking to his staff, and
Mm.
it was a funny thing. My dad happened to show it to me, but it was not him as shock jock Howard. It was him as the entrepreneur and building this thing, and he was so angry because he was saying their show had something like 40 million listeners per show, and he was saying, somebody like Leno or Letterman at the time had about a million. And he said if David Bowie were deciding whose show to go on, he would go on Letterman or Leno, and he wouldn't go on Howard Stern. And he was angry because he was saying nobody knows this about us, and we aren't getting that out. We aren't getting that word out. And the whole thing is him very upset, but driving this big point, about getting more A-list celebrities on. He wanted one A-list celebrity a week, and you really saw exactly that change happen after that speech and the initiatives that they put in place. That's what happened. And so I think there's often anger in defending a standard.
Mm.
And so when you want a high standard, it can come out as anger. And so whereas nobody wants just rage and just general people being upset or tantrums around the office. You do want people who can speak their mind, and
Mhm.
optimally that would be very early, right at the beginning, but that's not really how human beings work. A lot of times you have to suffer the standard being broken for a long time before you finally are fed up. And so when you have leaders like that in your company, I think your company grows.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. I do feel, I mean, it resonates with me as well because it was always, me, it was through sports, but channeling my anger and kind of rage to be in a way that's constructive and to be more performant in sports was always very useful to me. So I could see that if there's a constructive way to use it in a business context, that could be quite useful as well.
Well, and it's interesting, I've got three kids, 6, 7, and 8 years old.
Mm.
I get angry with my kids, right? The problem would be if I got, just completely enraged or just, off the wall angry with them.
Mhm.
But
Right.
but getting angry with them when they're annoying somebody, or when they're, when we're at somebody's house and they're being rude, that's a good time to be angry to the right degree, and
Right.
it puts them right back in check. So I think that the people that are, the kind of non-angry people, usually have dogs that pee on their rugs. They usually have
Mm.
kids that are rude and entitled. Right, the non-angry people don't have a great track record. So it's an important to integrate.
I think there's a spectrum, right? Like you got to express it to some degree, but it can't be too much or too little. You got to
Yep.
be in the sweet spot. Can't repress it. You can't be like some rage monster either.
And that's, that was the first place I came across it. Was Aristotle in the Ethics says that anger is a virtue, but it's a virtue to be angry at the right thing or person at the right time for the right amount of time to the right degree. and
Right.
and you start to realize, yeah, that is right. Road rage, when somebody cuts you off and you're swearing that you're going to destroy them, that's not good anger. Right, because it's not proportional. Yeah, but being angry when your kid walks through a room without introducing himself to their guests, your guests, that's a reason to say, what the hell do you think you're doing? That's the right response.
So maybe just to close it up, you're building something that's going to define war and peace in the next century. What do you hope on the other side? What do you hope the world will look like? And what keeps you up at night? as well about what you're building.
Yeah, well, I very much think what I hope that it looks like is being able to compare, number of innocent deaths over other centuries and watch that go down. I think that we've had this idea that peace is going to be achieved through kind of kumbaya moments and through just discussing things. I don't think that's realistic in any case, and history really does not like that argument. But having controlled attacks, having more tools at the disposal of political leaders allows them to engage in smaller conflicts. And so I think that's what we'll see over the course of this 100 years. Is I'm hoping that we look back at this and think there were fewer innocent lives lost than there were in the last century and the century before that. That to me is realistic progress that you can hope for.
Sounds great. I hope that's the case as well. Mike, thank you so much for joining me. It was a very interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to see what you do with this company and to reading your book and using my anger constructively. Thank you. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sacha.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond Borders and joining us to celebrate the journeys, the successes, and the stories of immigrants making their mark in the U.S. If this story inspired you, please like, follow, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast. You can also find more information at beyondborderspod.com. Your support helps us keep making and sharing these inspiring stories. Until next time, keep going, keep growing, and go beyond borders.